Um, Welcome to It's a Brain Thing. I may lose my voice a little bit here and there. I've been having a little cold, so if it doesn't hold up here, I'll do the best I can. I'll whisper or something, I suppose. So welcome to It's a Brain Thing. And this month's edition, we're going to talk about addictions. I did this talk. It's probably been over a year ago, maybe a year and a couple months ago. I did this particular talk, but I want to do it again because I never got it filmed. So it's not on the internet, and it's also it hasn't been on TV yet. The reason I think this is such an important topic to talk about is because I think we talk a lot in here about stigma, and when things aren't understood very well, that people stigmatize them and discriminate against them. With things like depression, that's starting to get a little better. I think if you say to somebody that you have depression, maybe they don't blame you as much as they used to in the olden days. Okay, they still have some of that. There's certainly still some of that. But with addictions, it seems like it's still something that we all tend to think of. Well, somebody's got a weakness if they're addicted, And I think one of the things that's coming out now about the science behind addiction is something that I think folks that have worked in this field have known for a long time, which is that this is not a character flaw. This is an illness of the brain. And so what I want to share with you guys tonight is some sort of my personal experience with seeing folks with addiction, and kind of share with you where I started and where I am now with kind of my own knowledge, but also share with you some information, some of the science that some of the researchers in the field have been doing, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. So first of all, where did I start out? As you guys know, I came out of residency in 1998, and I started seeing patients in Newcastle. And I had a couple of therapists there that challenged me. One of the things that I was doing was I was thinking the same way a lot of people think, unfortunately, and that is that I couldn't do much for folks with addiction. They just had to make the conscious decision, give it up, don't use again, that kind of thing. And I would almost blame them sometimes if I was trying to treat their depression and they were addicted too. I think I was guilty of saying, I'm sorry, it's your fault, you're using, I can't help it, I can't do anything about it, And that was kind of ignorance on my part. And some of the therapists challenged me, and they said, why do you look at that differently than bipolar disorder or some of these other illnesses that you treat? I stopped and I thought, I don't know, I guess I shouldn't probably. And so then the more I started seeing patients and started learning about this, to give you an example, I saw a woman who was addicted to cocaine, and she knew she was on probation and she was getting drug screens, and she knew if she used again, she was going to lose her kids. And she used again. And so I thought to myself, now, is this just a choice? Is it just a conscious choice? I just don't want to use again, and as easy as that? It can't be that easy, right? If it was that easy, we wouldn't have addictions, right? If it was that easy, nobody would ever use a substance of abuse. And for that matter, one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is that we think that a lot of these things, gambling, sexual addiction, overeating, food addiction, we think that these things are somehow linked, and it's the same kind of pathway or process in the brain that has gone awry that leads to these things. So if it was so easy to just not overeat, we wouldn't have obesity, would we? Right? These things aren't that easy. If it's so easy to quit smoking, you wouldn't have to take medicines, and you wouldn't have all this problem, all these people addicted to cigarettes, right? It's not easy. It's not just a conscious choice. I learned that early on, and I guess when I start talking to you about the parts of the brain that are involved, it's going to kind of make sense, at least I hope. And if it doesn't, please ask questions, okay? So I guess, a lot of times in here, I challenge you guys to think about your brain in a different way. I'm going to do that again tonight. There's some things in your brain, a lot of things in your brain, that happen all the time that you don't even think about, you're not even aware of. So let me throw out some of these things here that have to do with addiction, okay? Think about how these things might have to do with addiction. But for example, why do you eat over and over again? You taste food and it tastes good. I don't know if you ever none of us consciously feel like we have to think every time we want to eat, right? We just sort of know when it's time to eat and we eat, right? And then the foods that we like, we eat them over and over again, don't we? We like them, okay? There's got to be a part of our brains that says, God, that tastes pretty good. I'd like to have some more of that. I think I'll do that again. That was pleasurable. So eating is something that is one of those primitive things that our brains, even animals' brains, have, so that they'll do it again. If you didn't remember or it wasn't pleasurable to eat, humans would have died a long time ago, right?
because we wouldn't have eaten and we'd have starved. Same thing with sex, right? If sex wasn't pleasurable, we wouldn't do it. And what would happen to our species, or any animal species for that matter? They would become extinct because it wasn't pleasurable. So think about it for a second. Where does the pleasure come from? Where does that drive or that motivation to eat and drink and have sex, where does that stuff come from? It has to be the brain, right? So the easy way to think of this is I call it the reward center. There's a reward center in your brains. It's not that simple because it's not only a reward center. It's also a part of your brain that lights up when you eat something that tastes terrible. Okay, there has to be a way in your brain for it to know, gee, I tasted that, it was pretty good, I want to do that again. And remember that that was what I ate and it was good, and I'll do it again. By the same token, what if you ate something that tasted like crap, or something that made you puke all over the place, right? You want to remember, hey, that wasn't very good, I don't want to do that again. Okay? So there's a part of your brain that does that. I don't know if you guys ever thought about that before, but if you haven't, then I need you to, because this is where addictions come from, we think. This is one part of the brain. So think about this pathway in the brain, and there are some chemicals involved in this pathway in the brain. Last month we talked about dopamine as it pertained to dopamine in some parts of the brain being too high, and schizophrenia, and these folks would see things and hear things they couldn't control, they weren't real, We think dopamine is one of the primary things that's involved in this pathway, this reward center that I just talked about, okay? One thing that has been found is that this reward center in the brain in folks with addictions, or at least folks at risk for addictions, it isn't working like it should. Okay, so they'll eat a meal, or they'll have sex, or whatever, and those are just regular everyday things that for most of us, those should light up our reward center and say, okay, let's do that again. With addictions, these folks' reward center isn't wired like it should be. The underlying issue, we think, is there's not enough of this dopamine, but don't worry about remembering that. Just think that part of the brain isn't wired and isn't working like it should. Okay, so the messages don't get through as well. Now, for example, what happens if a person like this that doesn't have enough transmission, enough of that part, that part of the brain isn't working very well? What happens if they take something that stimulates that part of the brain 5 to 10 times greater than sex or food or regular everyday things? Okay, what example of something like that would be cocaine or methamphetamine or alcohol, okay? So what happens is the folks take this stuff, it lights up their brain. It makes up for what they don't have enough of, plus, okay? Well, they did this study and they wanted to see, how do we know that this is not having enough this activity in this reward center? How do we know that's related at all to addiction? They did this fascinating study where they took one of the things they did was they took these folks and they put them into a scanner, and they could scan that part of the brain to see how active it is, okay, at baseline. And then they found that some folks had normal reward centers, and some folks had lower than normal reward centers, okay? And then they gave them both methamphetamine. And they asked them, how did that feel? And the folks that didn't have enough dopamine or didn't have enough of that reward center wasn't working right, they said, man, I like that. I want some more of that. It lit their brains up. And when you looked on the scans, it lit their brains up like a Christmas tree. When I say lit them up, I mean the activity in that part of the brain was showing like it was just boom, it was gangbusters, okay? Now the people that had regular sort of run-of-the-mill normal reward centers, they gave them the methamphetamine too, And these folks said, I can take it or leave it. I don't know if it doesn't do much for me. You look on the brain scan, it didn't go up much more than where they were to start with. That's fascinating, right? That they're correlating brain activity with how it feels when they use the drug. So that gives you some idea that now they're able to sort of correlate the underactivity in this part of the brain with why it feels so good when they use the drug. Okay? Okay, now that's not all the story, but that's part of the story. I want you to keep that in mind, so that here's a person with that could be at risk for addiction. They're walking through life. They don't have enough of this reward center. It's not working like it should. So everyday stuff that should be pleasurable, that should be good enough, is not good enough. Okay, but then all of a sudden, they're teenagers or whatever, and somebody says, "Hey, try some of this stuff. This is good stuff, man. Come on, give it a hit or whatever." And they do it. They don't know that their reward center's messed up. But all of a sudden now they do it, and it's like, wham, I love that stuff. I got to have some more of that. can't get enough of that, this is a person who's going to become addicted. Okay? The problem is, of course, that when you're a teenager, we don't know if you have lower than normal activity in your reward center or not. You don't know that until you use the drug, you know. So about the best advice we can give folks is that we think maybe some of this is genetic. So if you have a family member that had addictions of some kind, and by the way, this can be addiction of any kind. This is not only methamphetamine. We think that this is the case with methamphetamine, alcohol, cocaine, Valium, opiates, doesn't really matter. Any of these drugs, we think it's the same kind of thing. So these folks don't have any idea that they're at risk for addiction. But but like a lot of teenagers, you start experimenting, you think nothing can happen to me, just one time I'm going to hit it, it's not a big deal. Next thing you know, you have an addiction. And that's the scary part. Maybe someday we can do a scan, for everybody, like the scan I was just telling you about, and it'll be good enough that we can say, hey, if you use any of these drugs, you got about a 1 in 2 chance of becoming addicted. I don't know if that would help people or not, but maybe it would. Maybe folks would say, 50-50 chance. I don't think I'm taking those odds, I don't know. But suffice it to say, though, that you got to realize there's a part of the brain, there's several parts of the brain. I'm going to go into the next one in a second, but this reward center is one part of the brain that's not working right in folks with risk for addiction. I think I made this clear, but you understand that it's not the drug that causes the reward center not to work. The reward center is not working to start with. Then when you get the drug, that's what the combination of those two things leads to addiction. Does that make sense? I guess that's kind of a key point. I don't want you thinking that the drug somehow damages the reward center and then that is what leads to the addiction. That's not what we think happens. Now, how does that, I guess before we leave the reward center, they've done some more research. It's kind of neat, and I'll go ahead and go into this. They were trying to figure out, now, why would the reward center be, what's causing it to be abnormal, okay? Now, I would imagine that this again, genetics is probably one thing, but they wanted to know is the environment, because can the environment play a role in this? Can you start out with a normal reward center, and then something in your environment can damage it or affect it in some way, which would then set you up for addiction, okay? So they did this study with monkeys. Listen to this one. This is kind of interesting. They took these little baby monkeys and they raised them in isolation, okay, by themselves completely. Now, to a monkey, that's a pretty stressful thing. Probably to a human as well, I would think. Human babies, they need contact. They need to be cared for and all this. Well, these monkeys, they raised them in isolation, okay? Then they took them after they were so old. I don't know what, probably teenage monkey age. I don't know what that is, but not as long as our lives, of course. And they took them and they put them in with each other. Mix them all in together, okay? Well, as monkeys will often do, and humans do the same kind of thing, they developed into a hierarchy. So there were some monkeys who became dominant and some monkeys who became submissive, okay? Interesting enough, when these little monkeys were raised in isolation, after they, right before they put them in together, they scanned their brains and they looked to see if their reward center was normal or not. And sure enough, all of them, every single one of them had a lower than normal reward center. Okay? So then they put them all together, and they wanted to see what would happen. So they looked at the dominant monkeys, and they looked at the submissive monkeys. The dominant ones, their reward centers kind of came back to normal. So the reward center in those monkeys were working pretty much like a normal monkey that had never been raised in isolation. Okay? Then the submissive ones, they didn't change, so they stayed kind of low. Their reward centers weren't working as well at all. Okay? Then they took these monkeys and they gave them, all of them, cocaine, okay? The ones that were raised in isolation became dominant and had normal reward centers. They could take it or leave it. So they didn't really hit the bar and say, I want more cocaine, I want more cocaine. They didn't really, they hit it once, that was it. The submissive monkeys that didn't have enough of this reward center, the reward center wasn't working very well, they hit the cocaine over and over and over. As a matter of fact, in animal studies, it's been shown that sometimes animals will hit cocaine over and over again and ignore completely their food and water to the point to where they die. So that tells you how powerful that these drugs are. But in any case, the theory here is that some kind of stressor in the environment takes a brain that maybe would have started out normal and messes up the reward system in a certain way and then sets them up for addiction. Okay? Now let's think about that for a second. Now this is monkeys, I'll grant you that, okay? But certainly if the same thing held true for humans, I mean, what would this mean? This might mean, just theoretically, it might mean that if we could decrease abuse in childhood, or we could decrease neglect, or we could decrease stress in some way in these folks' lives, maybe they wouldn't be as at risk for addiction when they become teenagers and start to experiment. And then they experiment, I can take it or leave it, and then this person maybe has been saved from a lifelong addiction. I mean, I'm probably taking this a step too far, but let me tell you, this all stuff isn't my idea. I heard this lecture from Nora Volkow, who is she's a doctor, she's a psychiatrist, she's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And so she had given this lecture and it summarized all this stuff, and then I sort of took it and I'm trying to make it into sort of plain English to bring it to the masses, so to speak. Okay, she was basically lecturing to psychiatrists and would use all the lingo and all that, but I'm taking it down and trying to explain it. And hopefully it's making sense, because it was pretty powerful to me. I listened to this and I thought, man, how could I blame somebody? You know, their brain wasn't working like it should. You know, how could I blame somebody for that? Well, that was her point too. Okay, so is the stress the only thing? And like I said earlier, it's probably not the only thing. So there's probably some genetic risk too. So if you have a family history, like I was saying earlier, if you have a family history of somebody in your family that's had addiction, and that, I don't care if it's alcohol, I don't care what it is, but some kind of addiction, you probably ought not to use. Okay, it's like Russian roulette. You don't know if your brain's wired that way or not. But it's a higher chance that it is wired that way if you have somebody in your family that had addiction, because you know their brains are wired that way. Okay, or they wouldn't be addicted. Okay. Now, it's not all that simple, okay? There are some people who use a certain drug over and over again, and they end up, this really doesn't get them high anymore, you know? And so they keep using, even though they don't get high anymore. So think for a second about that. That's probably not just the reward center thing, right? Because if they're not getting that experience of, hey, this feels really good, that means the reward center is probably, you know, there's something, that's not the issue, okay? Because it's not sending them the message, man, I love that stuff. But there's some reason they're continuing to use, okay? It turns out there's a pathway, besides just the reward center, there has to be, the reward center tells you it's good, I want to do it again, or it's bad, I don't want to do it again. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. But there's another part of the brain and it's right above, it's the frontal part of the brain, right above the eyeballs, and it's called the orbital, means right above, you know, orbit basically is the eyes. Frontal, which is the front part of the brain, cortex, okay? That part of the brain does a lot of things. One of the things it does is it gives us the ability to not do something that we know is not good for us, okay? The reward center just says, hey, I love it, I want to do it, okay? The front part of your brain has to kick in and say, yeah, but you might lose your kids. Or yeah, but I might end up in jail. Yeah, but I'm going to lose my job, okay? That's the part of the brain that I think, that's the part I was just talking about, hey, I'm blaming folks with addiction. Well, so the theory is, okay, is that part of the brain messed up? Are these folks is it not quite as easy for them to just say, I see the beer there, but I've had issues with alcohol, I'm not going to drink it, If this part of your brain I was just telling you about, if it's not working like it should, then theoretically these folks would have a harder time doing that. Okay? Maybe you might call that willpower. I don't know what you call it, but that's one thing that people say in the lay public is, if you just had better willpower. Well, it could be that the center of the willpower isn't working very well. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, if your brain's wired a certain way, I don't know that I can blame somebody for the way their brain's wired. I mean, I don't know if you guys can either. I mean, I don't think it's probably wise to do that. So that part of the brain, that's one of the things it does. Another thing that it does is it gives you sort of a scale of how good or how bad something is. So the reward center says good or bad, but this part of the brain says 10 out of 10, 0 out of 10. Okay? Chocolate, broccoli. You know what I mean? It's the thing that it gives you sort of a meter, if you will, okay, on how much you like something. Okay? That's two things it does. Now, another thing that it does is it also is responsible for kind of compulsiveness and stuff. Okay, we've talked about OCD in here before. That's exactly the same part of the brain that is not working right, and when people have OCD. And these are folks, you know, OCD is where obsessions, and then the compulsions is what I'm talking about. But a compulsion is where you have a certain behavior that you do over and over and over again, and you can't. It's kind of hard to stop it. It becomes almost like a habit. Okay, so that's the third thing that this part of the brain does. So imagine for a second, you know, think about this stuff with addiction, by the way. Okay, compulsive use, right? And you get this rating of, you know, is it good? Is it very good? Is it, you know, that kind of thing. And then the ability to sort of stop and think, or the willpower, if you will. I guess I can put it that way, the easy way. So it does those things. So these folks doing the research, they decided, okay, now let's put these folks in the scanner and let's see what this part of the brain, you know, when does it light up, okay? And another thing they found was it lights up when somebody's thirsty or when somebody's hungry, okay? So the primitive centers in the brain are saying, we need food. This part of the brain is saying, get some food, okay? Get something, get it now. So it's responsible also for telling or sort of driving you to do something that sustains life, okay? Now, as you can imagine, all of these things sort of have they could definitely have some relationship to addiction, I would imagine, right? Can you guys imagine that? You know, compulsively using over again, you know, driving a person to use whatever it is, you know, rating how much they like it, and then also helping them, you know, decide, if you will, I don't know if I should say decide, but helping them sort of say to themselves, I know it's really good, but I shouldn't, okay? And sure enough, they found that this dopamine chemical is also low in folks that have risk for addiction in that part of the brain. So it's low in the reward center, low in that orbital frontal cortex right above here, and the combination of the drug sort of lighting up the reward center, and then also the person being driven to use, and you have addiction. Can you imagine that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, when I think about this, it's like the deck is stacked against these folks, you know? You know, their brain lights up when they use it, and it's really, really rewarding to use it. But then you say, okay, well, yeah, but so what? That's okay. That's okay. Still, you ought to be able to, you're human, you know, you should be strong, quote unquote, and just don't use. It takes this part of the brain to do that. If it's not working, it ain't going to happen, right? Okay, so let me give you an example. This is something Nora Volkow was talking about, Dr. Volkow, and I thought this is kind of interesting. She uses addiction, to think about addiction, she says, use the analogy of thirst, okay? You're stranded in a desert for 3 days, and you're dying of thirst, and you get rescued, and then somebody sets you down at a table and says, here's a glass of ice water, I don't want you to drink that water. Now what are you guys going to do? Right? Maybe somebody that has a really overdeveloped and very good orbital frontal cortex, maybe they're able to put it off for a few minutes. But you're going to die, right? I mean, how long can you live without water? Not very long. So your body and your organism is saying, I don't care what you say, pal, I'm drinking this stuff. So you drink it, right? What's doing that? What's driving you to do that? It's the same thing that drives an alcoholic to drink another beer. It's the same thing that drives a cocaine addict to hit another, to take some more cocaine. It's the same thing, okay? So as soon as you start blaming somebody that has addiction for using again, I want you to stop and think about yourself, and I want you to stop and think, you know, when you say, geez, I shouldn't eat that other piece of chocolate, but you do anyway, or when you know, I shouldn't drink this or that, or when you eat this or that, it's the same kind of thing that's going on in the brain, okay? Has anybody, you guys thought about that kind of thing before, and correlated that stuff before? I think it's fascinating. You can see people, even if they don't have addiction, folks that have issues with eating, it's the same kind of thing, right? They get heavy set, they have trouble with obesity, and their doctor says, you really got to stop this. You know, maybe they even have heart attacks or strokes or something else related to the trouble with their weight. And, you know, sure enough, they're eating and they're eating and they're eating. And it's not easy for those folks to just flip it off and say, I'm not going to do it anymore. They're driven to eat like that. And there's some brain problem or brain issue that's causing that. This dopamine chemical, too, we know that it's also involved with memory in some way. So these folks, they'll use, and then where they're using, sort of the environment they're using in, can kind of become, there can be cues and things, okay, really powerful cues to use again. So a person that has a cocaine addiction might see powdered sugar, and man, they really there's this the pathway that says, wow, I remember that cocaine, I got to have some more of that, and they go seeking it out. So all these things kind of contribute, and it makes it obviously not very easy to give up a substance of abuse. Okay. I kind of glazed over this a little bit, but you know how thirst is recurring. So like you can drink and it satisfies the thirst, but then after a while you're going to get thirsty again, right? Same thing with addiction. So you can take the drug and it satisfies you for a little bit, but then after a while it's the same kind of thing as thirst. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's kind of the craving and the drive to use again. Now I don't want you to think that it's an absolute thing. So that the folks that have risk for addiction have all of these problems or none. It's probably a combination or a mix of this stuff, right? So some people, maybe it's the reward center that's the main issue. Some people, maybe it's this part of the brain. Maybe in some people it's both. Okay, and those are the folks that maybe unfortunately end up dying because they use until they die. They drink until they die and things like that. So it's none of these things that we talk about in here are absolutely there or absolutely not there. It's a combination. It's some kind of complicated mix of this stuff. Okay. Obviously, when we do the studies, that's kind of hard to sort out. So what you end up finding is you find the worst case scenario. So you find out what's the worst case scenario, and then you kind of have to kind of guess or extrapolate what it might be for the folks that are somewhere in the middle that aren't necessarily, that are functional, let's say. Okay, maybe because you guys know, right, with alcoholism, some folks will drink until they drink till they're dead, right? Cirrhosis of the liver, all the things that can happen, and they end up dying. Other folks, they drink for years and years and years. They're probably alcoholic, but they're functioning. They're able to go to work. They don't lose their job. They don't lose their spouse, maybe. And there's some difference there, right? There's something that drives that other person to continue till he dies. And so there's variations of all this stuff, is I guess what I want to tell you. And as you can imagine, is it likely that we're going to find one particular medicine that's going to cure this? Doubt it, okay? I mean, we talked about dopamine, that chemical, and anytime you do anything in the brain, you see dopamine's all over, right? We talked about schizophrenia and how it's affected there. Well, if you increase this dopamine chemically, you'd think that'd be easy, right? We just increase dopamine, and then that would treat all of this, right? Well, some medicines that we use for addiction help a little bit with that. Wellbutrin for quitting smoking, what's it do? It boosts dopamine, right? But number one, it does that all over the place. Okay, not just in that part of the brain, or these two parts of the brain I'm talking about, but it does it in lots of different parts of the brain. All right, so it's not so easy. And unfortunately, when you do that, sometimes you can have side effects and things that you don't necessarily want. Okay. Remember, we talked about with schizophrenia that if you gave somebody, they had too much dopamine in one part of the brain, and we said, okay, well, that's easy enough. Let's give them a medicine that blocks that. Well, then what happens, right? You get too much of that, and what happens? They get Parkinson's. They look like they have Parkinson's. Well, it's not not like Michael J. Fox has, where the nerve cells die off, but you're blocking them. You're blocking the nerve cells. And that's in one other part of the brain that controls motion and movement. Okay, so as you can see, it's not so easy. And so the more complicated and the more different pathways that are involved, the harder it is to develop a medicine or a treatment for these things. And so I don't want to paint a bleak picture. I think research is constantly going on. And so if you can, let's say you could even fix like one particular issue, that might still be quite a good thing for a lot of people. Okay, I mean, we do have medicines that can help cut the craving, let's say, for some addictions. They're not perfect, and they don't lead to. It's not like you take let's use Wellbutrin and smoking for example. It's not like you guys that have tried that, and I'm sure there's a lot of you that have tried that. But as you know, it can help you cut down. It can help you quit. But it isn't something where you take it and 3 days later, hey, don't need these things anymore, and you throw them away. I've never seen that. Now, maybe I'm sure there's some person out there that happened for, but their brain was probably not wired the way the rest of the folks that smoke brains are. And remember too that I think these things, gambling and sexual addiction and food addiction. By the way, I didn't used to believe in sexual addiction, but it does sort of make sense that there might be people who it it takes excessive amounts of sex or sexual activity or that kind of thing to light up their brain, where the rest of us it doesn't. And then that obviously with any of these disorders, if it doesn't interfere with your function, it's not a big deal. So if your spouse or significant other doesn't think it's a big deal, then it's probably not going to lead you to treatment. But if you end up being losing your job because you're on porn sites all day long at work, well, that's a big deal, right? There's a problem there. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface in understanding some of these things. But I would almost guarantee you that it's all the same pathways in the brain that's involved. The other thing that's interesting about that is, have you guys known anybody, ever known anybody that had like one addiction and then they quit? They were able to get treatment and they were able to give up that addiction, only to kind of fall down into another addiction, right? How common